Hello and welcome to another episode of Talking Conservation. Today I'm at Stow Maries. Maries with Ian Flint, who is the director of the museum here. And so we've come to talk to Ian about the museum, about the various properties on site and what they're doing here. Now, I first got involved many years ago when I was actually invited here by the previous owners before it had become a museum. I didn't get that job. But then Ian was appointed and it went to an HLF bid, and the company I was with was successful in the first stage. And that's how we got to know each other, wasn't it? So tell me, Ian, what's your background? How did you come to be here in the first place?
Well, I don't know what sins I did in my former. No, I'm a museum guy, I suppose. I started out working in Norfolk Museum Service. It's the largest museum service of its kind, and I had great fun doing all manner of interpretation and working with facilities and everything. And very quickly on, I realised that I enjoyed having a foot in each camp. So I enjoyed talking about fine art, and I enjoyed talking about why the walls were falling down. At the same time, I enjoyed making sure that the walls didn't fall down. So from there, I spent some time there, and then I ended up working with National Trust, and I took over an estate for them. And then after that, I was there for a while and ended up working for what is now English Heritage Trust, at the time where Historic England and English Heritage Trust became two separate entities. I was based in London for that. And then while I was down there, I've been there a few years, a friend of mine who looks after Bletchley Park got in touch and said, Stow Maries is coming up. Mm-hmm. And as is usually the way with the museum world, we all know about the superlatives. So we know about the youngest, the oldest, the shortest, the fattest, the widest. And because it's the oldest, only one left, we knew about it. And as sheer chance, in 2008, I wrote an interpretation brief for this place when National Trust were looking at it, long before I worked for them. Anyway, I got talking here, and I came over, and it was horizontal rain, and it was miserable in the middle of nowhere, and it was a goat track to get to it, and I kind of had to walk around, and I ended up having coffee. And it wasn't open to the public particularly, and I sat in the car park afterwards with a friend of mine. I said, don't know, and her exact words I won't use, but along the lines of, don't give me that rubbish. I've seen that grin before. And it was just struck me the potential. A, it deserved to be looked after, and B, the potential of what it could achieve just blew me away. So next thing I know, it's May the 3rd, 2016, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer. And that's how I came to be.
You just said that it's the only one.
Yeah.
So you came here to this rare site, but tell us about it. And tell us what the place is.
Well, this is actually unique. Stow Maries Great War Aerodrome, as it is now, was first in 1909, the Turner family bought it to farm it. And then a few years later, someone got shot in Middle Europe. And before you know it, we're all at war. And by this time, the Royal Flying Corps had been formed. The Royal Flying Corps were given back the job of protecting the capital and southeast England from the attacks of Imperial Germany. It had been held up by the Royal Naval Air Service, but they couldn't have the resource. They didn't have the resources. So they gave it back to the RFC, and as is the way with a military unit, right, if we're going to defend something, first thing we do is we set a perimeter, and for that we need higher ground. And so they the way to think about it is they looked at rings of defence. And broadly speaking, one of the first rings of defence was where the M25 motorway was. And there were other rings further out. The way that all aircraft were navigating, and to a certain extent still do to some case today, is by following rivers. Yeah. And they decided to pop air stations, as we would now call them, air bases or camps in the army term, on those rivers, so we could launch patrols and, if possible, response raids for incoming or exfilling aircraft. This was set up, RFC Stow Maries, as it started out life in 1917, was set up to patrol and look after the Crabs, the Blackwater, and elements of the Thames. That's what is here. As we sit here right now, 23 two-star listed buildings, all on the at-risk register, grade A. Most of them single-skin construction. We've got a 1949 bungalow on site. We've also got two modern hangars. The original hangars were knocked down in World War II. But what makes it unique is it's the largest collection of Royal Flying Corps buildings left in the world, including 4 examples of buildings from the original template that are nowhere else left in the world. The roles of those buildings may have been done somewhere else, but the actual type of buildings bespoke for that purpose, they're nowhere else. It ended its life in 1919, May 1919. As RAF Stow Maries, and when it ended its life, they basically took everyone from here, set up the newly centralised fighter operations at Biggin Hill, and then anyone who they could get rid of, as is the way, they demobilised them, and padlock was slammed on the gates. A couple of years later, the Turner family, who are still resident up the road, they managed to get enough money to buy it back, and they bought it back at twice what they were paid for it. But they got all the buildings as well, and they also got a lot of resources, and they got about 48 huts of different sorts as well. So they got quite an estate. Yeah. And as you can imagine, farmer was over the moon. Yes, it cut into his money quite significantly, but he got a heck of an estate, and he had suddenly accommodation for all his workers and stuff. And so it remained until 2004, when the son of the man that originally bought it back decided he didn't want to farm it anymore. And his son-in-law at that time was still farming the area, and he said, no, and it went for sale in 2008. In 2008, it was purchased by a private, very wealthy man who had been given the idea of how it could be a fantastic industrial estate, working and using the buildings for performance management and engine development for race cars and stuff like that. That kind of happened, and some of the buildings were renovated to accommodate that. And then one day, the gentleman with all the money, his wife won the lottery. And they said, why am I even thinking about this? And we got on a plane to the British Virgin Islands, and that was the last they were seen. And it was put up for sale. The tenant at the time, who was operating the engine business, really wanted to buy it himself, but he couldn't get any funding. But thankfully, he did manage to get in front of the Community Minister for Culture and Heritage in Essex County Council at the time, the sadly recently passed away Jeremy Lucas. And he and a number of other people at Essex County Council spearheaded a drive. They put in a couple $100,000 in loans. Malden District Council followed suit, put in 100,000 in loans. And then the Heritage Memorial Fund threw in 1.5 million. And that was what affected the purchase. And then, to be honest with you, it kind of bumped along for a year or so with £10 in the bank. What on earth are we going to do? And so the story goes, and I do really hope this is true. I don't think it is, but so the story goes. Two local MPs from Malden and Witham in Essex, respectively, were either side of their boss, Mr. Osborne, at the time. It was 2014, and he was trying to work out how he was going to use the libel fund to fund the commemorations of the Great War. And so the story goes, hang on, I know what I'm doing with the naval campaign. We can put some money into something that looks towards Jutland in Scotland. That's no problem. I know what we're doing with the ground campaign. We can pump money into everything around the country and in France. And fantastically, they did so. But what on earth are we going to do about the air campaign? And so the now Sir John Whittingdale and Dame Bridget Patel went, hang on, between our two constituencies, we've got this place called Stow Maries. So in 2015, announced in the budget, was the first time most of the people involved in the site heard about it. We're going to get £1.5 million. And that was the nest egg, and the only, and I don't want to use the word caveat because it wasn't anywhere that strong, but the strong advice was you need to find someone who knows a little bit about heritage. And as I always say, they couldn't find anyone who knew what they were talking about, so they got hold of me instead. And I arrived, as I say, May 3rd, 2016. There we go. Whistle stop tour.
Well, I love it. Just to sort of help paint the picture, and for the YouTube, those on the YouTube, we'll put some pictures up on it. But can you try and paint the picture of the types of buildings that you've got in terms of, because there's a broad range of buildings in terms of, I suppose, what their uses are and how their construction is. But it'd be lovely to kind of help get an idea of a flavour for those listening on the podcast for what sort of things they look like and what you're dealing with.
All of the buildings of the original estate are single skin, single story buildings with piered and wooden truss roofs.
Single skin, means just the single
one level of roof. We refer to them as London 100s. It's not really the right accurate term, but everyone, if we say London 100s, they know what they mean. So it's just straightforward red brick buildings. In some cases, they have a shelter coat, a sacrificial painting coating on the outside. And you can see the differences. The original ones, the original colour is like a battleship grey, and that was there to protect that single skin red brick from degradation based on wind and wet and everything. And in some cases, we've re-established that, but we weren't allowed to use the grey because that looked a bit miserable. So we were told we had to use a kind of a beige colour. And that's fine. What's not fine is, unfortunately, we have to have it specially made in Bristol, and it's about 40 quid for a square foot's worth. So it's not exactly cheap. Yeah, and the buildings, wooden roof trusses, tiled roofs mostly, although there are some panelled roofs. But the main thing is, and what it's really interesting, moving from a conservation point to a visitor experience point of a museum, most museums where they've got historic buildings are worried about accessibility. Well, our entire site is single story. It's all ground floor. So whereas there are some challenges with things like cinder paths, which we use road scalpings to replicate. So sometimes the ground's a bit bumpy, but actually all the buildings are all accessible for all those people with mobility access issues. The challenge is getting heating, water, power into those buildings. And so we're on a gradual scheme working to a plan we call Stow Maries 2032. And the idea is to bring all of the estate off the at-risk register. The buildings themselves are essentially the ones that survived. We've got some of them were, shall we say, hospitality areas. So we've got the airman's mess and the officer's mess. A mess being an area where people could eat and relax. The airman's mess is fully renovated. It's back in use, and it now hosts our cafe. So we have a cafe, and you sit down and have a wet and a wedge, as we call it. You have a cup of tea and a slice of cake, or a full meal, where the enlisted did. The officer's mess, we've now got that weathertight, watertight. It's roofed. The internals are there. The windows and the window furniture are back in. But that was very much a 4-star hotel in its day, and that's quite a distance off being usable. We've got officers' accommodation blocks. And in fact, one of those officers' accommodation blocks, building 33, is the only one left in the world that's got the internal cabins left in it. And these are only separations, don't get me wrong, but they're there because the farmer used it to accommodate his farm workers. The other two weren't really finished. We've also then got a series of what were trade workshops. We're sitting right now in what was the dope workshop, which was the area where very thick nail varnish-like material was applied to linen in order to repair aircraft. And that was done in this building. So we've got a series of workshops. And lastly, and most importantly, of the original buildings, we've got the MT sheds, the motor transport sheds, which were open-fronted, and they were largely basic garages. But they're all, as I say, ground floor, single skin, one story.
Walking around the site, and on the YouTube, where we'll put some images, because I've been around many times, got lots of pictures, lots of video shots, and people will be able to see the different states of repair. And they'll notice that you've got some actually propped up at the moment. What's the story with that? I mean, obviously, you say they're accessible, but they're accessible theoretically, but some of them clearly are in such a state that they're not accessible. I mean,
what we think about is what are the areas that we need desperately to make sure the visitors get into, so we can generate income, so we can move the project forward. And within the hub of the site, all those buildings are done and fine and lovely. Well, the buildings that are propped up further afield, shall we say, which are either in segregated areas for building site work or possibly in some cases in wildlife areas, they are the ones that are affected mostly by the movement of the site. With regards to the makeup of the grounds of our site, if you could do a scan, it would look like cow print, because we have clay and loam and all sorts of bits and bobs. And as we can imagine, with the conditions and climate as it is, including, we have noticed in the last 8 years, the effects of climate change, we see particularly the clay swelling or shrinking depending on the weather. And therefore, where we have buildings that are highly mobile, and there are a few of them that are highly mobile, they will be propped. There's one building in the mortuary, building 9, that at this time of year, there will be a noticeable curve in the upright elevations. But in high summer, they're straight as a die. That's where that flexing comes from. That's where the propped up buildings are. But the thing to remember is these buildings are very, very simple constructions. The fact they're here at all is amazing, because they're only in the last 5 or 10 years, as is always the way with these things. But because they're such a simple construction, if the roof is okay and the piers are okay, and that goalpost, as we think of it, as long as your goalposts are okay, it'll be fine. We make sure we don't make anything weather tight until the roof and the piers are sorted, because the moment we put windows in, the weather can't dry out and the wind has got something to push against, and then we're in trouble. Yeah. So it's a long-term prospect, and we have some areas, as you say, that are propped, but those are the ones that we know what we're doing with. There's others that have got, shall we say, more scaffolding around.
But one of the problems you've got here, well, a problem, and it's something that I've come across with many Victorian Edwardian buildings. A lot of our listeners and viewers will have buildings with single-storey outshots, extensions built in the early 20th century that are single-skin, so very similar to this. And one of the things it's got here is hoop iron. I mentioned this to Rich the other day. Would you care to explain hoop iron and how are you dealing with it?
Hoop iron is nature's way of saying you've got too much time and money on your hands. No, not at all. So hoop iron is a technique that is not technically used in the same way anymore. It's a technique by way of strengthening the elevation, that single skin elevation. And essentially every 5 quarters of brickwork you put in a glorified metal coat hanger. And the idea is that adds structural integrity, which is fine as long as the mortar doesn't split. And if we remember the mortuary I mentioned with those walls, what happens is, and this is where our problems start, is as that elevation is compressed and we see the curvature, the mortar cracks, water gets in. It's not water getting in that's the problem. It's not the movement problem. What happens is the hoop iron then gets rusty and that expands. So even when it levels out again, suddenly we've got a larger hoop iron and that's mortar split. And we've done a number of things. We've had some of them removed. And as you go around, you can see the ones that are removed because we've got some, you can very clearly see on the ends of the buildings where we've done those experiments. And that works fine. Some of them, what we've done is we've remortared using standardized mortar. And in some cases, we've left it as is. Where we've got buildings that are moving, we have a response. It may be that we involve structural surveyors. It may be that we monitoring system, but where we have cracks in mortar on buildings that are mobile, we will have a response and we act on it as quick as possible because we know that if we either don't take it out or treat it in some way or seal it in, it's the beginning of real trouble with that building and particularly that elevation. Because obviously if you get one elevation that's out, the other one isn't, you're into all sorts of difficulties. How's that?
Excellent. Because I actually had to do the condition survey for the very first bid. And I noticed obviously the hoop iron. And what's interesting is because obviously the expansion of as it corrodes, it expands and lifts the whole thing. And because these are not very heavy buildings, it lifts it quite easily. And of course, some of your walls have just toppled over.
Actually, very few of them, to be fair. There's been 3 buildings, and I have to say, as a matter of pride, all before I got here. I'm not suggesting. No, you're all right. I'm just being funny. No, we have lost a few. Before I got here, we lost a few, and it was because at that time there was still very early days. Do you remember I mentioned about having someone they wanted to bring people in that had a bit of an idea of what was going on? So there was a lot of really well-meaning people involved, but actually they naturally assumed buildings had foundations. They naturally assumed they weren't a raft. They naturally assumed it's just cracking the mortar. They hadn't any experience or hadn't had any of that time, hadn't absorbed any information or knowledge about the hoop iron. So there was. When you and yourselves came in, and I believe it was Pilots Ready Rooms that you were dealing with first, came in for that, and suddenly there's this huge injection of knowledge, and the board at that time of trustees are going, oh my word. So whereabouts they're in most buildings, you say, oh my word. And that really did progress into a very different mindset. As you say, the buildings are very light. It can make a very, very quick impact. But actually what we've found is of the buildings that were lost, or rather the elevations that were lost, some of them there's only one that was actually, we think, probably hoop iron. And that was an officers' mess annex, which is a four elevation building. But what they did is the roof looked like it needed repairing. So some very well-meaning people at the time said, well, we'll take that we'll take the roof trusses off and we'll repair them, because they didn't know what they were looking at. So the roof trusses come off, and surprise, surprise, 2 weeks later, well, we haven't finished yet. They can't go back on. Well, actually, don't worry. That was very quickly dealt with. And to be fair, I have the highest respect for any of the guys and girls that were involved in this in the very early days, because they were not only blind, they were blindfolded. And to a certain extent, hands tied. They had no money in the bank. They were trying to do their best. Well, there's one particular thing I'm thinking of where there was a pseudo Dutch barn effect that was on the side of one of the sheds, the MT sheds. And they said, well, that's not right. That needs to come out because it's post-Great War. I mean, obviously, we now understand, well, the story of the building. That building didn't stop in 1919. I understand exercises to remake it and return it to 1919 condition. But either way, at the time, before my arrival, that decision was taken, let's get that down. But no one had actually done any investigations and said, right then, so is it going to be okay to take that down? And the first they found out was when someone came in, phoned up the board and said, I'm watching the walls move. And suddenly, instantly, emergency grant, £32,000 worth of structural honest interventions to get that building secure again.
You mentioned wind earlier on, and because we're on a slight rise, you're exposed, it's an airfield effectively. We come back to talk about the airfield side of it, but obviously wind is quite an issue.
We can get 55-mile-an-hour gusts here. And usually, I can say this now, usually at 6:30 in the morning, it's not what you want getting out of the car. It can get very breezy. But what's interesting is it's the second highest promontory in the Essex County. And there's a reason they built an aerodrome here. But it's kind of microcosm of climate, because it can be absolutely hooning down with rain here, and then 5 minutes up the road, it'll be glorious sunshine. and the reverse. A couple of years ago, we actually had an air event here, and I'll never forget it. A lady from the local council turned up and said, "You're brave. There's yellow weather warnings everywhere, and you haven't cancelled." I said, "Well, no, because it's Stow. We don't cancel events. Even if our aircraft can be blown like kites, we don't cancel. And the reason we don't cancel is because there's a fair chance, if it's miserable everywhere else, it's going to be glorious here." Yeah. And that day really was. It was one of those wear a Panama and try not to get sunburned days where everyone else was fighting through the rain. It was incredible.
The final question I've got on the technical side of things relates to something I saw when I was here, and that's asbestos. Mm-hmm. Because am I right in thinking that during the time it was a farm, that some of the roofs were replaced with asbestos sheets? And there's quite a bit of asbestos. Now, you're a site open to the public. Now, a lot of people are sort of asbestos will run a mile because they think, oh, we're going to get problems. So, and quite understandably, quite rightly. But how did you deal with it? How are you dealing with that?
Okay, well, the first thing is to actually find out where you've got asbestos. So as you're quite right to put it out, when we looked at the histories of the various buildings we've got, a lot of research was done and investigations. Where we found we had asbestos in panel form, which is where most of it is, the first thing we did was get samples. Let's find out what we're dealing with. And to be fair, with the exception of 2 buildings, it was all crystallized anyway. So therefore, it's actually a form of asbestos that's very simple to deal with compared to most forms of asbestos.
And regarded as a lower...
It's a lower risk. Now, that doesn't mean in any shape or form we take it seriously. But what we've done is we've identified, right, so we know what we're dealing with. So we're not dealing with bubonic plague. What we're dealing with is measles. So we understand. Okay, fine. And then what we need to understand is we make sure we've got a really firm learning, but with everyone who's dealing with it, okay, so what are the rules with handling this stuff? So we don't look at smashing it up. We don't look at breaking it down. We deal with it in the way that it's meant to be dealt with. We take very serious guidance from it. We make sure that we are equipped appropriately to deal with it. But there's a difference between being so terrified that you can't do anything and being informed of the risks you're dealing with. We face risks every day of our working lives, every day of our private lives. This is a simple, different risk. So I would always say with anyone who's dealing with any asbestos, find out what you're dealing with first, find out what the guidance is, and then simply adopt the right way of dealing with it. We found that, don't get me wrong, it can be expensive. But we found that it wasn't actually that complicated a process to get the right people in to take away that and dispose of it appropriately. What we have done, though, is we've got people that have attended training courses, and we know when we're going into a building to first work on it, first thing we're doing, let's do it. It doesn't matter if there was one done a while ago. Let's do an asbestos survey. Let's find it. Go on. What's really handy for us is actually it's the panel asbestos that is the main issue, and that's actually only in 2 of the panel buildings. All the rest of the roofs being slates, where ironically enough, where we found most asbestos here, again, a form we could deal with, was actually the 1949 bungalow that someone sat. It was the rainwater goods of that we had to deal with. And that was, you go up there and say, okay, guys, usual rules. Oh, it's all right, it's the bungalow. Nah, usual rules, let's find out. And sure enough, 5 minutes later, yeah, we've just had a look and we think. But, always with everything to do with any kind of construction and any kind of conservation construction work, find out what you're dealing with, get the guidance, get the professional advice, and act on it.
Would love to pick up with you, Ian, in terms of about that guidance and about getting the appropriate level of instruction, I suppose, or guidance from the professionals. One of the things that I've always struggled with or found a challenge with my home, and I know many of our other listeners will be the same, is where do you get your resources from and where do you turn to? And how can you be assured they have the appropriate qualifications and competence to be able to advise on that? You mentioned about the Hoop Iron earlier on, and no disrespect to those that came before now, not necessarily understanding Hoop Iron and the influence it has on buildings. How, for example, do you know, well, this is the right person for this particular task, and this is what we need to follow? Would love to know your thoughts on how you've navigated that.
It's a really good question. How do you know what you don't know? Absolutely. Well, here within Maldon district in Essex, we're very lucky. One of the first things that I did when I got here was introduce myself to the planning conservation officer. And I spent a long time with him chatting about things. And he's a real keen supporter. I regularly make sure that he's coming to the site. I also made sure, because of the nature of the work we were doing, obviously Historic England as an organisation is not only an organisation that is connected and we need to be working with, but I was lucky enough to have some connections from my time working with English Heritage, as it became. what I managed to do, and I would always advise people to do, is make that contact with your district council planning. There are people within Historic England that you can literally Google it, or you can talk to people. There are people who will advise you. Now, they may not be able to give you do or die advice about you don't want to do that to your house. They're not going to do that, but they will definitely be able to, or they should be able to, tell you who you might speak to. What I've found traditionally in my time here is that there are people who are willing to help. And of those people, there are some that are looking to gain business from you out of it. And unfortunately, that's a balance that everyone deals with differently. As a charity, we have maybe a little bit more oomph to sit in front of people like Historic England and Heritage Lottery Fund and say, okay, we want to do this. It's okay. The planning side of things is fine. We've had this advice. This is why we think we need to do it. And also, as a charity, I go out of my way to make sure I recruit people at board level who have got some knowledge. For private individual projects, I fully appreciate it's a lot harder. But I do believe your local planning conservation officer, and if you would ask Historic England, you can reach out and contact them and just say, look, who do you think we should talk to? Because they will have a list of approved advisors. And it's just a case of then, admittedly, there may be some of those advisors that have a fee attached to them. Some of them may be able to or willing to give you some advice pro bono on the grounds that you're not kind of holding them up in black and white in case something goes wrong. Again, reach out and talk to people.
Really great advice, and I appreciate that. What I'd love to know is that's getting the advice and the guidance on a project. What about getting people to execute that guidance? So in order to the contractors, have you found it tricky to find people that are going to execute a particular scope of works in the right manner, I suppose, because that's another real challenge that I know homeowners have, and would love to know your experience of that.
There has been some challenges. I think there's a couple of bits of advice I would always give, and I wouldn't dream of suggesting I'm a level of professionalism where I could advise everyone, because every case is different, every project is different. Of course it is. There has been complications getting trades. There were political decisions made around the year I came here that have had a real impact on us being able to get hold of good quality trades who are willing to do the work at the pace that we need it done, at the level of quality we need it done. That being said, I think you need to be present when you're dealing with your contractors. You need to be very clear about what your expectations are. If you're dealing with a complicated project, be it a private build, be it a commercial build, or be it a charitable work like we're doing, you can't be hands off to any greater extent. It's fine saying I'm going to project manage it from over here. I'm going to pop off. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. You need to be present. You need to be seen to be present, and you need to be able and comfortable with challenging. I'm not in any way and will never be a bricklayer, but I know if I'm looking at something and it looks awful, I'm going to comment. And I'm not going to quote trades, but there was a particular trade that was being used on this site. And it was of a reasonably large firm. And I was looking at, it was something so simple. Ground level, rainwater good drainage point. That's all it was. And I looked at what he was doing and I said, excuse me, are you going to leave it like that? And he said, yeah, it's fine. And I went, okay, are you telling me that's fine as far as you're concerned? Yeah, cool, lovely. Do you want to get in your van? You're going. And that firm, I made it quite clear, while he was getting in his van, I phoned up the overseeing lead contractor, shall we say, and I made it quite clear that firm was not welcome. Because if I can see as a non-trade, non-bricklayer that's not good enough. Do you know where you are? You're at Stow Maries Great War Aerodrome. You don't get to act like that here. And we're very, very lucky that approach has been taken the way it's meant to be taken, which is we're working on this together. We are trying to make sure we're all getting the best we can. And I would always advise that presence and that approach. No one's saying you have to be, walking and stalking around like you are, Oberstgruppenführer. You're not there to show people how to do their job. Absolutely. We used to call it clipboard mentality. No one walks around with a brown coat and a clipboard and gets anything done. The only reason you walk around with a clipboard is to make it look like you're getting something done. We all know that. But if you've got contractors, if you've got multiple disciplines, multiple trades, you need to be confident, even if you're not confident on how they're going to achieve that objective, that task. You need to be confident what it's going to look like before it sits down. And you will have worked that out with your designer, your architect, whatever. And if it doesn't look like it's meant to, ask. And it's very quick, usually, very quick before someone says, "Oh yeah, actually, no, we're just putting it just for now. We're going to be doing that again. When are you going to do it again? When is it? You were going to leave it like that? No. All right. So okay. So who is doing that when? And just have the confidence. No one is saying you have to be an architect. No one's saying you have to be a bricklayer. No one's saying you have to be, an electrician or a plasterer or whatever. But you're the one who's going to be dealing with it. So you need to be able to look at it and say, why does it look like that? And if they're not prepared to answer the questions you've got honestly and straight up, then are they really the people you want to be working with?
That's such great advice. I mean, I'm very much looking forward to grab that as a snippet and share that, because that's just brilliant. From what I understand, Ian, as well, you've used a fair bit of volunteer force for supporting and helping some of the works you've done on site. Would love to know how you find the volunteer force, make sure they're competent in what they're doing, make sure they're correctly supervised, and also how do you keep them enthusiasm when on such a long lead time project, in terms of still wanting to come back day after day to actually keep it, to see it through to its fruition?
I think there's a complicated story. If I could write it down and bottle it, I'd be a fortune maker, I tell you. I think the thing to hit on first is there has to be a passion for what you're doing. So in the first instance, when I sat down with a number of the people that were here at the time, they felt that they had a passion, but they weren't gaining traction because essentially there was a lot of, well, you're volunteers. So, we want people to do this. We want volunteers, Well, with my background in the museums and the heritage community would fall over tomorrow morning if you got rid of volunteers. We cannot exist. We do not have the resources within the museum community to operate at any level without volunteers. So I sat down and I said, right, first things first, we're going to rethink what volunteering is about here. We're going to rethink its mission, for want of a less official term. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to appeal to everyone by saying not everyone can do it. And it sounds really silly because the first thing we're doing is saying we want volunteers, and then we're saying, but not everyone. And actually, that's the complicated thing. And it's a complicated thing for one reason only. If you ask most people to define what a volunteer is, and in fact, I'm going to test this, what would you say a volunteer is? How would you define what makes him a volunteer?
Well, I'm thinking I volunteer at Duxford, so yeah, okay. Why would I volunteer?
What is the defining category? Not why do you volunteer? What is the defining characteristic of a volunteer?
Interest in the subject matter.
You can be an employee and have that.
I would go with a selfless commitment towards a common goal, something like that.
But you could be an employee and have that, and it's really good. And I have to say, it says a lot about both of you that you haven't jumped to what most people jump to straight away, which is, they don't get paid. They're doing it for free. They don't cost you anything, or they don't get paid money. And that's the thing we had to get over, because number one, volunteers do cost money. They just don't cost a salary payment, which is not the same thing. And two, volunteers do get paid. They just don't get paid money. They get paid a sense of purpose. They get paid a communal goal. They get a sense of camaraderie. They get paid possibly new skills. They get paid a chance to challenge isolationism in their own home. They get a chance to spend time developing and delivering something. So they are paid in so much as they are rewarded. They're just not paid a salary. So volunteers cost us as an organisation money, and their deliverables, their output, is saving us money and generating things. They get paid for that output. They just don't get paid cash money. And that was the hardest thing to get across to people, because that's the bottom line. And I'm very proud of this in a very strange way. I remember a chap, Clive, he's now retired. He was completely deaf. And he was asked by somebody, he didn't know why at the time, but he was asked by somebody, so what would you be doing if you weren't here today? And the chap asking meant that Tuesday. And Clive responded, I'll probably be dead by now. He said, this place has kept me up, going out. After I lost my wife, I knew I had to get to Stow on a Tuesday, and I knew I had to get to Stow on a Thursday. What he didn't realise, and what we didn't realise at the time, was that chap was actually someone on behalf of a very austere organisation, August organisation called, at that time, the Queen's Award for Volunteering Service. And it's kind of the MBE for volunteering. And that report and various other visits that happened, we were given the Queen's Award for Volunteering. So in process, what we have, unlike a lot of places, there is an application process. Yes, it is a form. Yes, you do have to give us 2 references. We do check them. And if you don't give us 2 references, then it doesn't go any further. You get invited to a recruitment day. You spend some time with us. You go behind the scenes. And then you have an induction day. The induction day, by this time, we've got all your references. You've given us the sort of stuff you want to do. And bear in mind, there could be someone who spent 30 years in the city as a finance director. The last thing they want to do is pick up a computer. They want to pick up a shovel or get in a dozer or pick up a paintbrush. The last thing they want to do is work with computers. They might be someone who has studied, and in fact, one of our volunteers, Imperial War Museum director working with archives and photography. Whereabouts in curatorial do you want to be? Nowhere. I'll work in the mess, So we've established the sort of roles they want to do. They then go through a volunteer agreement, and it's very clearly, these are the values we have. And it sounds awfully glib, but we mean it. The reason being is we've learned the hard way. If you don't do it, you can get caught out. So we then establish with them that this is a volunteer agreement. This is the sort of stuff we do. We don't have things like, we never had health and safety like that when I was in. Yes, you did, because you were at school and you were at work after 1969. So yes, they did. In 1971, the Factories Act, 1974, the Factories Act, yes, they did. Don't say, let's not pretend. So no, we don't work with that. Yes, there are risk assessments. Yes, there are method statements. And these are things you're used to. Just because you don't want to, that doesn't mean they don't exist. So we get rid of all that straight away. And then we have a period where they must commit 10 hours a month to us as a volunteer. Now, there comes with it some benefits. If they commit those, they get tickets to events and they get discounts here and discounts there. But I can categorically say there's no person here volunteering today, tomorrow, or any time this year that is doing it for the benefits. They're doing it because they want to. They're doing it because they're passionate about it. After they get buddied up with someone, after a few weeks, we check in and make sure they're okay. But generally, we find they find their own level. We have a series of groups. Administratively, we separate them into flights, but in reality, there's very few boundaries between them. We've got 120 odd today. I think it's about 124 we've got at the moment. And they are E-Flight, which is estates and buildings, doing a lot of the work. They include a lot of trades, ex-trades and stuff like that. If we've got Sparkies, fine, they can do stuff. We just do not self-certify. So we'll always get an exterior body to come in and certify any work. Any heating systems, we've got heating engineers. Any heating systems, whatever we do, self-certify, nope, get someone in to certify it from outside, all that sort of stuff. There are complications, so there may be a lot of people that want to work with aircraft, and that is something you aspire to here. You aspire to get airside, but we cannot have anything remotely close to a wildcard airside, because here, as an active aerodrome, we follow the same rules as Heathrow. So if people want to work airside, then that is something that is dedication and aspired to, and there's got to be a track record that shows now these are the ones we could trust with rotors turning.
I'm airside at Duxford, so I know exactly where.
There we go. There we go. So volunteering is important to us. They are in every part of our organisation. All of our visitor-facing roles are undertaken by volunteers, and there's no doubt about it, with the exception of actually cooking in the mess. Every single facet is handled at some point along that process. If not the entire process, at some point it'll go past or through a volunteer.
Can we talk about funding?
Yeah.
When I came in, it was to do with the very first HLF bid. And as we sit here today, HLF are celebrating 30 years. On the way here on the radio, everyone was talking about it. Well, HLF, the National Lottery. I was here because of an HLF bid, Heritage Lottery Fund bid. So, tell me, after that, it then went to others, and it then what happened?
Well, essentially, that first step of talking to what was then the National Lottery Heritage Fund, that first step was very much about a group of incredibly well-meaning, dedicated individuals at board level saying, right then, so we want it to look like X. And what do we need to do that? Well, we need this to make it look like X. And so there was talk about a national bid, and it was all building towards a very large application, but it was being developed by a group of people at that time that had no experience in fund working at all. Very little experience working with the heritage site as such. there was a few of them that had some experience with working with buildings, agricultural buildings, and, well, that's just a shed. We can get that built for 60,000. What's the problem? Because it's not a shed. You've got to treat it like a teapot. Well, we shouldn't. Oh, unlucky. That's where we are. So I went through that and sat down with it. And the bits that I looked at from my background was, well, okay, the objectives and criteria of the fund, what you're thinking about is what the fund's going to do for you. Whereas with every single fund, bar none, you should be thinking about what you're going to do for the fund. So how am I meeting the criteria that you want? Because that's how I'm going to get my money. And also there's that other minor point that if you're going to ask a large fund for 5 million, well, you need to wonder how much they're asking you for. And at that stage, there was still quite a lot of confusion about it and that sort of stuff. And I remember one board member saying, look, you get on well with them, can't you just ask them to write us a check? Wouldn't it be easier? And you think, right, okay, I'm in Wonderland here, aren't I? So I must admit I wasn't popular, but I got through to the midterm review, which is at that point the discussion of how it's going to happen, what was going to happen. We'd had architects involved to talk about where there was going to be a visitor centre built and all this sort of stuff. And I just sat down with the board and said, look, you pay me to be your chief executive officer. I'm telling you that I am recommending you pull out because the organisation is not ready for it. It doesn't have the knowledge. It doesn't understand what it wants. There's no master plan. And if I was to ask every member of the board right here this second what the end goal was in 10 years, you'd all have a very, very clear picture of that. And there was much response to this. Yes, absolutely. I said, yeah, the important thing is that it'd probably all be different pictures. And that was also agreed. And it's not a negative in that regard. It was, okay, fair enough. And what was great, really good, is the Heritage Fund then sat down and they understood that. And they said, yeah, okay, that's a brave decision to make. So having looked at everyone and talked to everyone, we decided to take that decision that we weren't ready as an organisation. We withdrew from the bid, but what we did was we spoke at length with Heritage Fund and said, what about the work that we've done to find out where we are as an organisation? Let's turn the smile upside down. We've got this development award that's helped us find out we're not ready. There's still money to be spent. Why don't we spend it getting the museum situation accredited, getting our collections care up, getting visitor routes and visitor experience thinking done, and really apply lots of learning to try and bring it up so more of the organisation is aware. And thankfully, they were really, really supportive. And they went through with it. And so what we did was, even though we pulled out of the bid, we kind of got the benefit of stage one of that bid, which worked in our favour immensely. In a wider sense, it's always about trying to get core funding. All of the funding for Stow Maries Great War Aerodrome comes from either Stow Maries Great War Aerodrome trading as a museum, so the cafe, the shop, admission funds or something like that, donations, or it comes from me applying to various trusts and foundations. There are precious few trusts, foundations and award grant givers that give core funding. Everyone's quite happy to put their logo on a building. Everyone's quite happy to put their logo on a display case. No one wants to put their logo on the electricity bill. So that's where the hard work is. And there's no doubt about it. We are, to a certain extent, hand to mouth. If it hadn't been for some really supportive people in the city, we would be having a very different conversation right now, because our main access road got closed without warning this year, and it cost us £65,000 worth of lost income. And we had to battle to get that road opened again. 13 weeks it was closed in the middle of high season. And so our museum was dying on its, we couldn't get people in. Luckily, as soon as we managed to get the roadblocks off and removed, suddenly everyone started piling in again. But even then, I had to go out and on hands and knees and say, cash in some favours and say, look, really. And thankfully, there was one organisation that stepped in and said, yeah, not on our watch, and jumped in. I can't say who they are, they're not allowed. But they stepped in, and I have to say, that night, I can't lie, I did have a glass of wine that night. I can't. But all the time, building continues.
Yeah. If anyone is watching or listening to this and thinks, that's a good cause, I'd like to help support that, how can they contact you?
If you were willing or wanting to support us in some form, we welcome people supporting us in any way you'd like. The simplest way, if you want to give us cash money, if you go to our website, there is a big button on the front page. It says donate now, and that is stowmaries.org.uk. If you would like to work with us in partnership, so we have various firms that sponsor different things, drop us a line, get in touch with the website, info@stowmaries.org.uk. We have, if you look at our events program, there's events there that you think, oh, that'd be quite cool. I'd like to be involved in that. Give me a shout. We're always happy to talk to partners at every level. We're talking about, well, I wouldn't mind helping out printing some leaflets. Fine. Oh, actually, I'd like to sponsor hospitality at your next air show. Equally fine. Can we fix a building for you? Very, very, very fine indeed. But we're always here. We're always here.
And of course, you're quite active on LinkedIn, aren't you?
I can't help it. The social media thing, I had to kind of buy into that. I'm not natural at it, but as you will attest, I tend to batter it. We set up, if we don't count LinkedIn, there are 4 streams that we use officially, and there's a minimum of 4 posts a week, usually 5. It's anywhere between 16 and 28 posts a week, 4 different channels. Because one thing that we can't afford is marketing. Our marketing budget is next to zero, because guess what? No one's willing to pay for that. So, which is why, thankfully, the last HLF bid, which we're in the middle of an HLF project right now, they gave us a brilliant cash injection because they agreed. They said, you need marketing money. And that was wonderful. And we increased our marketing budget for 2024. We increased it by 600%, just in time for the road to be closed and us to watch the road crews turning away all these people, which was heartbreaking when you're standing there watching, and I'm not joking, watching cars stack up and they're turned away by road. It's heartbreaking. But there we go. We live to fight another day, and we're still kicking now.
So, Ian, a fascinating site, and I've really enjoyed actually going on the website and looking at some of the history behind, where it's come from with regard to being originally an aerodrome, then it was a farm, sports car restorations, and now the museum. What's the plan for the future? Because obviously your job, of course, is to have it as it is now, but what are the grand strategic plans in terms of what the future holds, in terms of whether it's going to be back to more aviation, for example? I'd love to hear.
Well, going forward, we have a very, very simple objective. Stow Maries will survive. We are going to make sure all those buildings are saved and returned to use, and it will become the centre of early aviation for Europe. That's what's going to happen. And by that, I mean we're going to be celebrating and commemorating its history as an aerodrome back in the day, but also it's a museum. So that's the thing to remember. This is a museum. It's not an aerodrome that happens to have some exhibitions. It's a museum, and part of that museum, thankfully, we still have air activity. So we can commemorate the work and the stories that were told here, become part of our local community, become part of a wider national community. And by 2032, there'll be a number of things that will be different by now. But now, the aerodrome itself, we are very lucky that one of the first battles we had was to increase the allowance of space and movements to allow more aircraft to use it. We're not looking at turning it into an international airport or anything silly like that. There will only ever be single-engine fixed-wing flying here. There will only ever be biplanes and all that sort of stuff. We're not interested in anything like that. Contrary to what some of the people have told me, sometimes April Fool's jokes go too far, and I think someone made a joke about us having BA divert some of their flights here, and by the time it got to the newspapers, that was seen to be a reality. I'd love to see someone try and get a 737 in here. That'd be hilarious. But so long-term plan, by 2032, we will be even more successful than we are now. All the buildings should be done by then, because by that time, we should have raised enough. It'll be about 20 million we need. And we will continue to be a successful and award-winning volunteering centre. We will continue to be an inspiration to independent museums. And who knows what the story to get there will tell. But it's definitely exciting, and I'll be honest with you, they're going to have to drag us out kicking and screaming. I've always found that with anything like this, the story we've got here is if funding or support, if it closes the door, fine, I'll go around the back and kick in the windows, but it's happening, and Stow Maries is here to stay.
That's excellent. I mean, you're very fortunate to have some brilliant support as well. I mean, I know that Historic England has been great, but your local conservation officer has also been quite supportive as well.
Yeah, Tim's fantastic.
We've spoken a lot about your background and how you came to be here, but what has inspired you most? What got you into it in the first place?
History, my expertise, is actually the 15th century. So I'm much more Richard III and all that stuff. So what actually got me inspired to come here was a thing called, it depends on who you talk to, so either sense of place or spirit of place. And it's the impact a place has on you by just being there. Because if you describe this place on paper, It's not the same. If you walk here, and even if you hear rotors turning or not, there's something about it. It just gets to you. And I've had the honour of working in everything from castles and Jacobean mansions to all sorts. So I count myself I can actually say, no, this is the strongest property story I've ever come across. That sense of place is amazing. So what inspired me to come here was a friend who knew that I am a crusader. I like to fix things. I like the idea of, hang on, this is somewhere that needs to be saved and it deserves people who are going to shout about it. So that's what inspired me to come here. What's kept me here has been the people and the place itself. And if I'm absolutely honest, there was a lady, one of the famous five, as we call her, a lady called Beryl. She was a professional archivist. Her husband he was a navigator on Lancasters during World War II. And shortly after I got here, I was introduced to her. And she was absolutely terrified. But she was one of the first people that campaigned to have this place rescued. She was the one who raised the money with her friends for a memorial that's still on site. And she lived in the church in Stow Maries. And she started to fall ill a few years ago. And I went round to see her. And she was evidently ill. She was an intelligent woman. She knew what was coming. And she said to me, quite honestly, she said, right, I've done my bit, Ian. It's now up to you. Don't let my Aerodrome die. And that's what's kept me. Sorry, it sounds awfully morbid, but
wow.
No. That's what. So there we go. As for reading a book, there's a very, very interesting book that's very atmospheric about the Great War. It was written in the 70s by Ronald Welch. It's a completely fantasy book about a guy who's a cavalry officer who joins an infantry regiment and then becomes a tank commander. It's called Tank Commander. I read that when I was 9, and it always inspired me that the Great War was a time of incredible heroics and incredible evolution of engineering and all sorts. And I would definitely ask people to read that, even if it is somewhat of a child's book. You wouldn't think so, because they would never release it as a child's book now. And ironically enough, my daughter, who's 31, heard me talking exactly like I'm doing now a year or two ago, and she found a copy and she bought me one as a Christmas present. So, yeah, so if you want to read a book and be inspired about Stow Maries, read anything about the Great War Aviation. If you want to be inspired by Stow Maries, come to Stow Maries. There we go.
Fabulous. The other question that we like to ask each of our guests, now we've sort of heard about a favourite book or an inspirational book you've had, is about a favourite building. Now, it's very obvious, I suppose, in terms of where you are, whether it's a particular building on the site you are or a different building, perhaps, that has kind of enthused your passion, I suppose, for restoring buildings and so forth. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
I can give you one of each. The one that inspires me here is the Officers' Mess, Building 34, and that's because when you walk in there, you're walking with ghosts. I've been in plenty of officers' messes in my time. Most recently this weekend, I was at a Taranto night this weekend, and therefore they have depending on where you're going and what they are, they can be anything from a very simple, plain, almost local council building with very perfunctory, what used to be referred to as NAFI furniture, I suppose it's now Sodexo furniture, right the way through to the older ones are much more sumptuous. But either way, when you walk in the Officers' Mess here, which is not open to the public right now, you're walking with the ghosts, and that it's inspiring because it needs to be saved. It's not falling down. It's in a great place. It's really in a strong position, but it's the jewel in the crown and it needs to be saved. So that inspires me here. Elsewhere, I spent a great deal of my time in Norfolk, and there's a building in Norwich which is open 2 or 3 days a week in the summer called Strangers' Hall. And the oldest part of the building is 14th century, and the most modern part of the building is late 19th, early 20th. It's absolutely wonderful. It's a great collection. It's handled by Norfolk Museum Service still. It's kept alive by a mixture of textile volunteers and curatorial volunteers. It's got a fantastic Tudor garden to it, even though it's tiny. And you wouldn't know it was there unless you know it's there. But that, ever since I first walked into museums, I walked in there and I thought, wow, it's because somebody woke up one day and said, no, we're not going to knock this down. We're going to look after it. And that is an inspiration. The example I use of how important it is there's a fantastic street in Norwich called Elm Hill. It's one of the largest. Norwich itself is the largest collection of Tudor buildings per head in the world. There's a road called Elm Hill, which is the largest street of Tudor buildings in Norwich and in England, as far as I'm aware. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it's in England as well. It was only one vote at council in 1931 that saved it from being demolished. That's how much of a hairline it was on. And if it's not done by you when you walk in there and say, no, I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen, you cannot rely on it happening to somebody else. You cannot rely on someone else saying, yes, I'm going to stop this. You need to be the one who's going to stand up and say, no, we're looking after this. We're going to rescue this. Yeah, so Strangers Hall inspired me, and the Officers' Mess here inspires me to continue.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. It's been fascinating talking to you. We could talk for hours more, but for now, thank you very much. And thank you for listening and watching wherever you are, and see you again soon. Bye. You've been listening to Talking Conservation,
The podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
with me, Stephen Boniface.
And me, Rich Aylesbury.